Hello everybody, and welcome back to the What I'm Sowing Today series. Today, February 20th, I have a slightly smaller group of seeds that I'm starting from my Midwestern Ohio Zone 6A garden. And if you missed February 13th's episode, go ahead and check that one out because for many folks, you still have time to sow the veggies and herbs I talk about in that video as well. So jumping right in, first up, I am sowing kohlrabi. Now, kohlrabi is one of my favorite underrated brassica crops. And if you watched the last video, you know that I started the majority of my brassicas on February 13th. Now, kohlrabi could absolutely be started at the same time as my cabbage and broccoli and cauliflower, but it tends to be a bit more forgiving in terms of weather fluctuations and warm temperatures. It's also a little bit quicker to mature than a lot of other brassicas. I've started kohlrabi indoors as late as mid-March with good results. It can also be direct sown, kind of in that same time frame I'd be looking at planting beets and late carrots. So kind of early to mid-April-ish. However, of all the planting times I've tried, I like this late February start date the best. Now, leafy greens are another group of veggies that can be both sown indoors or direct sown with great results here in my climate. With crops like chard, endive and escarole, and lettuce, my preference is to start a batch early indoors, typically mid to late February, and then start direct sowing out in the garden around mid-March onward, depending on the weather. With lettuce, I typically only start the heading types indoors, so things like romaine, iceberg, butterhead, etc., as these tend to take a bit longer to mature, and I like the controlled spacing that transplants give me. With leaf lettuces, sometimes also called cut and come again types, it's just easier overall for me to direct sow those. All of these leafy greens are also excellent candidates to start outdoors early in a cold frame. And two cool season herbs I like to start extra early are cilantro and dill. Much like my leafy greens, I like to start an extra early batch of these herbs indoors in February, and then also do some direct sowing outdoors a bit later, usually from about mid-March onward. Cilantro and dill are both extremely easy to grow from direct sowing, so if you are at all short on indoor seed starting space, I recommend skipping the indoor sowing and just opt for direct sowing. And these, again, cilantro in particular, are great candidates for cold frames. On a side note with cilantro, much like the spinach that I mentioned in last week's video, one of the biggest hurdles I see folks having with growing cilantro is not starting it early enough. Despite its popularity in being used with dishes with warm season lovers like tomatoes and peppers, cilantro is decidedly a cool weather plant. It's a green which I can often harvest clear up until mid-winter with no protection. I've also been able to overwinter it under low tunnels. It tends to bolt very quickly when the weather gets warm, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. Its small blooms are extremely attractive to beneficial insects. The seeds can be collected and used as the spice coriander, and if left to go to seed, it will self-sow readily year after year. But if you want to harvest it for the greens, just be sure to plant extra early in the spring and also look for slow bolting varieties such as Commander or Cruiser. Today I am sowing a few annual flowers as well, and first up are my petunias. Now, I am not a fan of the modern hybrid bedding petunias, but I do love the old-fashioned types like the wild violet petunia. This year, I'm also trying out balcony petunia and old-fashioned vining petunia. These types tend to be a bit slower out of the gate than the modern hybrids, so I do like to get them started extra early. Another flower or flowering herb that I would typically be starting this time of year is Calendula. However, in recent years, I have so many volunteers out in my garden that I haven't needed to start any from seed. Calendula is very easy to transplant, and in the past, I'd like to do an indoor sowing just to get an early jump start on those blooms. But it's also super easy to direct sow, usually from about mid-March onward. And calendula is typically one of the earliest blooms to appear in my garden. This plant with sunny gold, yellow, and orange blooms is very versatile. It's a great source of early season forage for pollinating insects. It's also a very valuable medicinal herb with a plethora of uses. I'm also planning to start poppies right now, specifically Papaver somniferum, also known as bread seed poppy or opium poppies. My preferred method of sowing this time of year is frost sowing. Now, to frost sow, you typically either go out after a snow, sprinkle the seeds on top of the snow, and then gently tamp down to ensure contact with the soil beneath. Or you can time out your sowing to just before a snowfall, sprinkle again the seeds on a prepared seed bed, and allow that snow to cover them up. Scatter sowing in the fall is also an option here in my climate and northward, but I don't ever seem to remember to do that. That being said, I did plant late last year. I think it was actually towards the end of April, and surprisingly had pretty good success with my Food Not Lawns remix poppies. This year, however, I'm more on top of it, so I will be sowing, if not today, in the next couple of days. Well, that's it. It was a short list today, but if you'd like to catch everything I'm sowing through the entire season, be sure to subscribe to my channel, Growfully with Jenna. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.